place, cabinets along the walls, even the long table that ran half the length of the room, and the armchairs that surrounded it. It was difficult to think of something the size of this ship being made of wood, and even after all her time in the wetlands, the sight of all that polished wood nearly made her gasp. It glowed almost as much as the gilded lamps, hanging unlit in some sort of cage, so they remained upright as the ship moved with the waves. In truth, the ship hardly seemed to move at all, at least in comparison with the boat they had been on. But unfortunately, the back of the cabin, of the ship, was a line of windows with the painted and gilded shutters standing open, giving a splendid view of the bay. Worse, there was no land in sight out those windows. No land at all. Her throat seized. She could not have spoken. She could not have screamed, although that was what she wanted to do. Those windows and what they showed, what they did not show, had caught her eyes so quickly that it took her a moment to realize people were there already. A fine thing. Had they wished, they could have killed her before she knew. Not that they showed any sign of hostility, but you could never be too careful with wetlanders. A spindly old man with deep-set eyes was sitting at his ease atop one of the chests. What little hair remained to him was white, and his dark face had a kindly look, though a full dozen earrings altogether and a number of thick gold chains around his neck gave his expression a strange twist in her eyes. Like the men above, he was barefoot and bare-chested, but his breeches were a dark blue silk, and his long sash a bright red. An ivory-hilted sword was through that sash, she noted with disdain, as well as two curved daggers to match. The slender, handsome woman with her arms folded and a grimly foreboding frown was more worthy of notice. She wore only 4 earrings in each ear, and fewer medallions on her chain than Malin din Toral, and her clothing was all in reddish-yellow silk. She could channel. Avienda knew that, this close. She must be the woman they had come for, the Windfinder. And yet it was another who held Avienda's eye, and for that matter Elaine's and Nynaeve's and Brigitta's. The woman who had looked up from an unrolled map on the table might have been as old as the man by her white hair. Short, no taller than Nynaeve, she looked like someone who had once been stocky and was beginning to go stout, but her jaw thrust forward like a hammer, and her black eyes spoke of intelligence and power. Not the one power, just that of someone who said go and knew that people would go. Yet she had it strongly. Her breeches were brocaded green silk, her blouse blue, and her sash red like the man's. The stout bladed knife in a gilded sheath tucked behind that sash had a round pommel covered with red and green stones. Fire-drops and emeralds, Avienda thought. Twice as many medallions hung from her nose chain as from Malin din Toral's, and another thinner gold chain connected the 6 rings in each of her ears. Avienda barely kept her hand from going to her own nose again. Without a word, the white-haired woman came to stand in front of Nynaeve, rudely examining her from head to toe, frowning in particular at Nynaeve's face and the great serpent ring on her right hand. She took no time about it, and with a grunt moved on from her ruffled object of study to give Elaine the same quick, intense scrutiny, and then Brigitta. At last she spoke. "You are not an Aes Sedai." Her voice sounded like rocks tumbling. "By the 9 winds and Stormbringer's beard, I am not," Brigitta replied. Sometimes she said things even Elaine and Nynaeve seemed not to understand, but the white-haired woman jumped as if she had been goosed, and stared a long moment before turning to frown up at Avienda. "You are not Aes Sedai either," she grated after the same examination. Avienda drew herself to her full height, feeling as though the woman had rummaged through her garments and twirled her about to look at her better. "I am Avienda, of the 9 Valleys Sept of the Tardad Aiel." The woman gave twice the start she had for Brigitta, black eyes going wide. "You are not garbed as I expected, girl," was all she said, though, and strode back to the far end of the table, where she planted her fists on her hips and studied them all again, much as she might have some strange animal she had never seen before. "I am Nesta den Riez Two Moons," she said at last. mistress of the ships to the Alpha Mir. How do you know what you know? Nynaeve had been working on a scowl since the woman first looked at her, and now she snapped. Aes Sedai know what they know, and we expect more in the way of manners than I've seen so far. I certainly saw more the last time I was on a seafolk ship. Maybe we should find another, where the people don't all have sore teeth. Nesta Den Ria's face grew darker, but Elaine, of course, stepped into the breach, removing her cloak and laying it over the edge of the table. The light illumine you and your vessels, shipmistress, and send the winds to speed you all. Her curtsy was moderately deep. Avienda had become a judge of these things. For all she thought it looked the most awkward thing any woman could ever do. Forgive us if there have been words in haste. We mean no disrespect to one who is as a queen to the Alpha Mir. That with a speaking look for Nynaeve. Nynaeve only shrugged, though. Elaine introduced herself again and the rest of them to strange reactions. That Elaine was daughter-heir produced none, though that was a high position among the Wetlanders, and that she was Green Aja and Nynaeve Yellow received sniffs from Nesta Den Rias and sharp looks from the spindly old man. Elaine blinked, taken aback, but she went on smoothly. We have come for 2 reasons. The lesser is to ask how you mean to aid the Dragon Reborn, who, according to the Jendai prophecy, you call the Coromor. The greater is to request the help of this vessel's windfinder, whose name, she added gently, I regret I do not yet know. The slender woman who could channel reddened. I am Dorail Din Iron Longfeather Aes Sedai. I may help if it pleases the light. Malin Din Toral looked abashed, too. The welcome of my ship to you, she murmured, and the grace of the light be upon you until you leave his decks. Not so Nesta Din Rias. The bargain is with the Coromor, she said in a hard voice and made a sharp cutting gesture. The shorebound have no part of it, except where they tell of his coming. You, girl, Nynaeve, what ship gave you the gift of passage? Who was his windfinder? I can't recall. Nynaeve's airy tone was at odds with the stony smile she wore. She had a death grip on her braid, too, but at least she had not embraced Sidar again. And I'm Nynaeve Sedai. Nynaeve Aes Sedai, not girl. Putting her hands flat on the table, Nesta Den Rias directed a stare at her that reminded Avienda of Cerilia. Perhaps you are, but I will know who revealed what should not have been revealed. She has lessons of silence to learn. A split sail is split, Nesta, the old man said suddenly, in a deep voice much stronger than his bony limbs suggested. Avienda had taken him for a guard, but his tone was that of an equal. It might be well to ask what aid Aes Sedai would have of us, in days when the Coromor has come, and the seas rage in endless storms, and the doom of the prophecy sails the oceans. If they are Aes Sedai. That with a raised eyebrow to the windfinder. She answered quietly in a respectful voice. 3 can channel, including her. She pointed at Avienda. I have never met anyone so strong as they. They must be. Who else would dare wear the ring? Waving her to silence, Nesta Den Rias turned that same iron gaze on the man. Aes Sedai never told Varrock, she growled. Aes Sedai never ask anything. He met her gaze mildly, but after a moment she sighed as though he had stared her down. The eyes she aimed at Elaine were no whit softer, though. What would you have of us? She hesitated. Daughter heir of Pandor? Even that sounded skeptical. Nynaeve gathered herself, ready to launch into an attack. Avienda had had to listen to more than one tirade sparked by the Aes Sedai back in the Tarasin Palace, and their habit of forgetting that she and Elaine were Aes Sedai too. Someone not even Aes Sedai denying it might bring the shedding of blood. Nynaeve gathered herself up and opened her mouth, and Elaine silenced her with a touch on the arm and a whisper too low for Avienda to hear. Nynaeve's face was still crimson, and she looked about to pull her braid out slowly by the roots, yet she held her tongue. Maybe Elaine could make peace in a water feud. Of course, Elaine could not be pleased when not only her right to be called Aes Sedai, but her right to the title of daughter heir was doubted so openly. Most would have thought her quite calm, but Aviendha knew the signs. The raised chin spoke of anger, had eyes open as wide as they would go, and Elaine was a torch to overwhelm Nynaeve's ember. Besides, Birgitte was on her toes, face like stone and eyes like fire. She did not usually mirror Elaine's emotions, except when they were very strong. Wrapping her fingers around the hilt of her belt knife, Aviendha readied herself to embrace Saidar. She would kill the Windfinder first. The woman was not weak in the power, and she would be dangerous. They could find others with so many ships about. We seek a ter'angreal. Except that her tone was cool, anyone who did not know her would think Elaine was absolutely serene. She faced Nesta den Riaz, but she addressed everyone, perhaps especially the Windfinder. With it we believe we can remedy the weather. It must trouble you as much as it does the land. Barok spoke of endless storms. You must be able to see the Dark One's touch, the Father of Storms' touch, on the sea, just as we do on the land. With this ter'angreal we can change that, but we cannot do it alone. It will require many women working together, perhaps a full circle of 13. We think those women should include Windfinders. No one else knows so much of weather, not any Aes Sedai living. That is the aid we ask. Dead silence met her speech until Dorail Din Iron said carefully, "This ter'angreal, Aes Sedai, what is it called? How does it look?" "It has no name that I know," Elaine told her. "It is a thick crystal bowl, shallow but something over 2 feet across, and worked inside with clouds. When it is channeled into, the clouds move. The bowl of the winds!" The Windfinder broke in excitedly, stepping toward Elaine as if she did not realize it. "They have the bowl of the winds." "You truly have it?" The Wave Mistress's eyes were fixed on Elaine eagerly, and she also took an involuntary step. "We are looking for it," Elaine said, "but we know it is in Ibn Udar. If it is the same—" "It must be," Malin Din Toral explained. "By your description, it must." "The bowl of the winds," Dorail Din Iron breathed. "To think it would be found again after 2,000 years here. It must be the Coromor. He must have—" Nesta Din Riaz's hands slapped together loudly. "Do I see a Wave Mistress and her Windfinder? Or 2 deck girls at their first shipmeet?" Malin Din Toral's cheeks reddened with a proud anger, and she bent her head stiffly, pride in that as well. Twice as flushed, Dorail Din Iron bowed, touching fingertips to forehead, lips, and heart. The shipmistress frowned at them a moment before going on. "Barok, summon the other Wave Mistresses who hold this port, and the first 12 as well, with their Windfighters. And let them know you will hoist them by their toes in their own rigging if they do not hurry." As he rose, she added, "Oh, and have tea sent down. Working out the terms of this bargain will be thirsty." The old man nodded. That he might dangle Wave Mistresses by their toes, and that he must send tea, were accepted equally. Eyeing Aviendha and the others, he sauntered out with that rolling walk. She changed her opinion when she saw his eyes close up. It might have been a fatal mistake to kill the Windfinder first. Someone must have been awaiting orders of the sort, because Barok was only gone moments before a slim, pretty young man with a single thin ring in each ear entered carrying a wooden tray that bore a square, blue-glazed teapot with a golden handle and large blue cups of thick pottery. Nesta Din Riaz waved him out. "He will spread enough tales as it is without hearing what he should not," she said when he was gone, and directed Birgitte to pour, which she did, to Aviendha's surprise, and maybe her own. The shipmistress settled Elaine and Nynaeve in chairs at one end of the table, apparently intent on beginning her bargaining. Aviendha refused a chair at the other end of the table, but Birgitte took one. swinging the arm out, then latching it back when she was seated. The Wave Mistress and the Windfinder were excluded from that discussion too, if discussion it could be called. The words were too low to hear, but Nesta Den Riaz emphasized everything she said with a finger driven like a spear. Elaine had her chin so high, she seemed to be looking down her nose. And if Nynaeve for once was managing to keep her face calm, she seemed to be trying to climb her own grade. If it pleases the light, I will speak with both of you, Malin den Toral said, looking from Avienda to Brigitte. But I think I must hear your story first. Brigitte began to look alarmed as the woman sat down across from her. Which means I can speak first with you, if it pleases the light, Dorail den Iron told Avienda. I have read of the Aiel. If it pleases you, tell me, if an Aiel woman must kill a man every day, how are there any men left among you? Avienda did her best not to stare. How could the woman believe such nonsense? When did you live among us? Malin den Toral said over her teacup at the near end of the table. Brigitte was leaning away from her as though she wanted to climb over the back of the chair. At the far end of the table, Nesta Den Riaz's voice rose for a moment. Came to me, not I to you. That sets the basis for our bargain, even if you are Aes Sedai. Slipping into the room, Varrock paused between Avienda and Brigitte. It seems your shore boat departed as soon as you came below, but have no worry. Windrunner has boats to put you on the shore. Walking on down the cabin, he took a chair below Elaine and Nynaeve and joined right in. When they looked at whichever was speaking, the other could observe them unnoticed. They had lost an advantage, one they needed. Of course the bargain is on our terms, he said in tones of disbelief that it could be otherwise, while the shipmistress studied Elaine and Nynaeve as a woman might 2 goats she meant to skin for a feast. Varrock's smile was almost fatherly. Who asks must of course pay highest. But you must have lived among us to know those ancient oaths, Malin den Toral insisted. Are you well, Avienda? Dorail den Iron asked. Even here the motion of a ship sometimes affects shorefolk. No? And my questions do not offend? Then tell me, do Aiel women truly tie a man down before you... I mean, when you... Cheeks reddened. She broke off with a weak smile. Are many Aiel women as strong in the one power as you? It was not the Windfinder's foolish fumbling about that had made the blood drain from Avienda's face, or that Brigitte appeared ready to run once she could manage to unlatch the chair arm again, or even that Nynaeve and Elaine were apparently discovering they were 2 bright-eyed girls at a fair in the hands of well-seasoned traders. They would all blame her, and rightly. She was the one who had said if they could not take the ter'angreal back to Egwene and the other Aes Sedai once found, why not secure these sea-folk women they spoke of? Time could not be wasted, waiting for Egwene Alvear to say they could return. They would blame her, and she would meet her toll, but she was remembering the boats she had seen on the deck, stacked upside down atop one another. Boats without any shelter on board. They would blame her, but whatever debt she owed, she was going to repay 1,000-fold in shame by the time she was taken across 7 or 8 miles of water in an open boat. Do you have a bucket? She asked the Windfinder faintly.
Chapter 14. White Plumes. The Silver Circuit was misnamed at first glance, but Ebu Dar liked grand names, and sometimes it seemed that the worse they fit, the better. The grimiest tavern Matt had seen in the city, smelling of very old fish, bore the name of the Queen's Glory in Radiance, while the Golden Crown of Heaven graced a dim hole across the river in the Rahad, with only a blue door to mark it, where black stains from old knife fights splotched the grimy floor. The Silver Circuit was for racing horses. Removing his hat, he fanned himself with the broad brim, and went so far as to loosen the black silk scarf he wore to hide the scar around his neck. The morning air shimmered with heat already, yet crowds packed the 2 long earthen banks that flanked the course where the horse would run up and back. That was all there was to the Silver Circuit. The murmur of voices almost drowned out the cries of gulls overhead. There was no charge to watch, so salt workers in the white vest of their guild, and gaunt-faced farmers who had fled from the dragon-sworn inland, rubbed shoulders with ragged tarabanners wearing transparent veils across their thick mustaches, weavers in vests with vertical stripes, printers in horizontal stripes, and dyers with hands stained to the elbow. The unrelieved black of Amadisian countrymen, buttoned to the neck, though the wearers seemed about to sweat to death, stood alongside Mirandian village dresses with long, colorful aprons so narrow they must be only for show, and even a handful of copper-skinned domani, the men in short coats if they wore one, the women in wool or linen so thin it clung like silk. There were apprentices and laborers from the docks and warehouses, tanners who had a small space around them in the crowd because of the smell of their work, and filthy-faced street children watched closely because they would steal whatever they could lay hand to. There was little silver among the working people, though. All of them were above the thick hemp ropes strung on posts. Below was for those who did have silver and gold. The well-born, the well-dressed, and the well-to-do. Smug men-servants poured punch into silver cups for their masters. Fluttery maids waved feathered fans to cool their mistresses. And there was even a capering fool with white-painted face and jingling brass bells on his black and white hat and coat. Haughty men in high-crowned velvet hats strutted with slender swords on their hips, their hair brushing silk coats slung across their shoulders and held by gold or silver chains between the narrow, embroidered lapels. Some of the women had hair shorter than the men, and some longer, arranged in as many ways as there were women. They wore wide hats with plumes, or sometimes fine netting to obscure their faces, and gowns usually cut to show bosom, whether in the local style or from elsewhere. The nobles, beneath brightly colored parasols, glittered with rings and earrings, necklaces and bracelets in gold and ivory and fine gems, as they stared down their noses at everyone else. Well-fed merchants and moneylenders, with just a touch of lace and perhaps one pin or a ring bearing a fat polished stone, humbly bowed or curtsied to their betters, who very likely owed them vast sums. Fortunes changed hands at the Silver Circuit, and not just in wagers. It was said lives and honor changed hands too, below the ropes. Replacing his hat, Matt raised his hand, and one of the bookers came, a hatchet-faced woman with a nose like an awl, spreading bony hands as she bowed, murmuring the ritual, "As my lord wishes to wager, so shall I right truly." The Ebudari accent managed to be soft, despite clipping the ends off some words. "The book is open." Like the saying, the open book embroidered on the breast of her red vest came from a time long past, when the wagers were written into a book. But he suspected he was the only one there who knew that. He remembered many things he had never seen, long gone to dust. With a quick glance at the odds for the morning's fifth race, chalked on the slate the Pullman held up behind the red-vested woman, he nodded. Wind was only the third favorite, despite his victories. He turned to his companion. "Put it all on Wind, Elysian." The tyrant hesitated, fingering the point of his oiled black beard. Sweat glistened on his face, yet he kept his coat with its fat, blue-striped sleeves fastened to the top, and wore a square cap of blue velvet that did nothing to keep the sun off. "All of it, Matt." He spoke softly, trying to keep the woman from hearing. The odds could change any time until you actually offered your wager. "Burn my soul, but that little piebald looks fast, and so does that pale Don Gelding with the silvery mane." They were the favorites today, new to the city, and like all things new, of great expectation. Matt did not bother to glance toward the 10 horses entered in the next race that were parading at one end of the course. He had already taken a good look while putting Alder up on Wind. "All of it. Some idiot clubbed the piebald's tail. He's already half mad from the flies. The dun is showy, but he has a bad angle to his fetlocks. He may have won some in the country, but he'll finish last today." Horses were one thing he knew on his own. His father had taught him, and Abel Cawthon had a sharp eye for horseflesh. He looks more than showy to me, Nalisian grumbled, but he was not arguing anymore. The booker blinked as Nalisian, sighing, pulled purse after fat purse from his bulging coat pockets. At one point she opened her mouth to protest, but the illustrious and honored guild of bookers always claimed it would take any wager in any amount. They even wagered with ship owners and merchants as to whether a ship would sink or prices change. Rather, the guild itself did, not individual bookers. The gold went into one of her iron-strapped chests, each carried by a pair of fellows with arms as thick as Matt's legs. Her guards, hard-eyed and bent-nosed in leather vests that showed arms still thicker, held long, brass-bound cudgels. Another of her men handed her a white token bearing a detailed blue fish. Every booker had a different sigil. And she wrote the wager, the name of the horse, and a symbol indicating the race on the back with a fine brush that was in a lacquered box held by a pretty girl. Slim, with big dark eyes, the girl directed a slow smile at Matt. The hatchet-faced woman certainly did not smile. Bowing again, she slapped the girl casually and walked off whispering to her Pullman, who hastily wiped his slate with a cloth. When he held it up again, Wind was listed at the shortest odds. Rubbing her cheek surreptitiously, the girl scowled back at Matt as though the slap had been his fault. "I hope your luck is in," Nalisian said, holding the token carefully for the ink to dry. Bookers could be touchy about paying on a token with smeared ink, and no one was touchier than an Ebu Dari. "I know you don't lose often, but I've seen it happen. Rarely, but I have. There's a lass I need to step out with at the dancing tonight. Just to see." He was a lord, no doubt about that. But pretty enough to dry your mouth. Good. She likes to too. I hear some illuminated. You'll be able to. But its trinkets make her smile. She won't be friendly if I cannot afford to make her smile, Matt. "You'll make her smile," Matt said absently. The horses were still walking in a circle above the starting pole. Oliver sat proudly on Wind's back. It is more than a plain face, a jug ear. In Ebu Dari races, all the riders were boys. A few miles inland, they used girls. Oliver was the smallest here today, the lightest. Not that the leggy gray gelding needed the advantage. "You'll make her laugh till she can't stand up." Nalisian gave him a frown he barely noticed. Gold was one thing Matt never did. He might not always win, but close enough. His luck had nothing to do with whether Wind won anyway. Of that he was sure. Gold did not concern him. There was no against the boys using their switches on each other. In every race so far, Wind had broke into the lead and stayed there. But if Oliver took any hurt, even just a bruise, Matt would never hear the end. Not from Mistress Anna, his innkeeper. Not from Nynaeve or Elaine. Not from Avienda or Brigitte. The one-time maiden of the spear, and the peculiar woman Elaine had taken as a warder, were the last he would have expected to gush with maternal feelings. Yet they had already tried to move the boy out of the wandering woman behind his back. Anywhere where he was the last place for Oliver, or for anybody. But one bum, and instead of telling Brigitte and Avienda they had no right to take the boy, Satala Anan would likely hustle him off there herself. Oliver would probably cry himself to sleep if he was not allowed to race anymore. But women never understood these things. For about the 1000th time, Matt cursed Nalisian for sneaking Oliver and Wind to those first races. Of course, they had to find something to fill all the idle hours on their hands. But they could have found something else. Cutting purses could have been worse in the women's eyes. "Here's the thief catcher," Nalisian said, stuffing the token into his coat. He did not quite sneer. "Much good he's done so far. We'd have done better to bring another fish instead." Julian strode through the crowd purposefully, a dark, hard man using a slender bamboo staff as tall as himself for a walking stick. With a flat-topped conical red Tarabonner cap on his head and a plain coat, tight to the waist, then flaring to his boot tops, well worn and plainly not the coat of someone rich. He normally would not have been allowed below the ropes, but he made out to study the horses and ostentatiously bounced a fat coin on his palm. Several of the Booker's guards looked at him suspiciously, but the gold crown let him pass. "Well," Matt said sourly, tugging his hat low, once the thief-catcher reached him. "No, let me tell you. They slipped out of his hands again. No one saw them go again. Nobody has any bloody idea where they are again." Julian tucked the coin carefully into his coat pocket. He would make no wager. He seemed to save every copper that came into his hands. All four of them took a closed coach from the palace to a landing on the river where they hired a boat. Tom hired another to follow and see where they're going. Nowhere dark or unpleasant, I'd say, by their clothes. But it is true, nobody would fall in the mud. He grinned at Elysian, who folded his arms and pretended to be engrossed in the horses. The grin was a mere baring of teeth. They were both Tyran, but the gap between noble and common stood wide in tier, and neither man liked the other's company. Women! Several finely dressed specimens nearby turned to eye Matt askance from beneath bright parasols. He frowned right back, though two were pretty, and they set to laughing and chattering among themselves, as though he had done something amusing. A woman would do a thing until you were sure she always would, then do something else just to fuddle you. But he had promised Rand to see Elaine safely to Camelin, and Nynaeve and Egwene with her. And he had promised Egwene to see the other two safe on this trip to Abu Dar, not to mention Aviendha. That was the price of getting Elaine to Camelin. Not that they had told him why they needed to be here. Oh, no. Not that they had spoken 20 words to him since arriving in the bloody city. "I'll see them safe," he muttered under his breath, "if I have to stuff them into barrels and haul them to Camelin in a cart." He might be the only man in the world who could say that about Aes Sedai without looking over his shoulder, maybe even including Rand and those fellows he was gathering. He touched the fox-head medallion hanging under his shirt to make sure it was there, though he never took it off, even to bathe. It did have flaws, but a man liked to be reminded. "Tarabin must be terrible now for a woman not used to taking care of herself," Julian murmured. He was watching three veiled men in tattered coats and baggy, once-white trousers scramble up the bank ahead of a pair of Bookman's guards waving their clubs. No rule said the poor could not come below the ropes, but the Booker's guards did. The two pretty women who eyed Matt appeared to be making a private wager on whether the Tarabonners would outrun the guards. "We've more than enough women right here without sense to come in out of the rain," Matt told him. "Go back to that boat landing and wait for Tom. Tell him I need him as soon as possible. I want to know what those fool bloody women are up to." Julian's look did not quite call him a fool. They had, after all, been trying to find out exactly that for over a month now, ever since coming here. With a last glance at the fleeing men, he sauntered back the way he had come, once more bouncing the coin in his hand. Frowning, Matt peered across the racecourse. It was barely 50 paces to the crowd on the other side, and faces leaped out at him. A bent, white-haired old man with a hooked nose, a sharp-faced woman under a hat that seemed mostly plumes, a tall fellow who looked like a stork in green silk and gold braid, nicely plump, full-mouthed young woman who appeared about to come out of her dress at the top. The longer the heat continued, the fewer and thinner garments women in Abu Dar wore. But for once he hardly gave them any notice. Weeks had gone by since he so much as glimpsed the women who concerned him now. Birgitte certainly needed no one to hold her hand. A hunter for the Horn, anyone who troubled her would be in a deep hole by his estimation. And Aviendha? All she needed was someone to keep her from stabbing everybody who looked at her crossways. As far as he was concerned, she could knife whoever she wanted, so long as it was not Elaine. For all the bloody daughter heir walked about with her nose in the air, she turned moon-eyed around Rand, and for all Avienda behaved as if she would stab any man who glanced her way, she did the same. Rand usually knew how to deal with women, but he had jumped into a bear pit letting that pair come together. It was a short road to disaster, and why ruin had not happened was beyond Matt. For some reason, his eyes drifted back to the sharp-faced woman. She was pretty, with vulpine. About Nynaeve's age, he estimated. It was hard to tell at the distance, but he could judge women as well as he could horses. Of course, women could fool you faster than any horse. Slim. Why did she make him think of straw? What he could see of her hair beneath the plumed hat was dark. No matter. Brigida and Avienda could do without his shepherding, and normally he would have said the same of Elaine and Nynaeve, however wrong-headed, conceited, and downright pushy they could be. That they had been sneaking out all this time, said differently, though. Wrong-headedness was the key. They were the sort who berated a man for meddling and chased him away, then berated him again for not being there when he was needed. Not that they would admit he was needed, even then. Raise a hand to help, and you were interfering. Do nothing, and you were an untrustworthy waste. The fox-faced woman across the way moved into his view again. What straw? A stable. Which made no more sense. He had had fine times in stables with many a young woman, and some not so young. But she wore modestly cut blue silk with a high neck right under her chin, trimmed in snowy lace, and more spilling over her hands. A lady, and he avoided noble women like death, playing haughty like a harp, expecting a man always to be at their beck and call. Not Matt Cawthon. Strangely, she was fanning herself with a spray of white plumes. Where was her maid? A knife? Why should she make him think of a knife? And fire? Something burning anyway. Shaking his head, he tried to focus on what was important. Other men's memories of battles and courts and lands vanished centuries ago filled holes in his own, places where his own life suddenly went thin or was not there at all. He could remember fleeing the two rivers with Moraine and Lan quite clearly, for example, but almost nothing more until reaching Caemlyn. And there were gaps before and after as well. If whole years of his own growing up lay beyond recall, why should he expect to recollect every woman he had met? Maybe she reminded him of some woman dead 1,000 years or more. The likely that happened often enough. Even Brigida sometimes tickled his memory. Well, there were 4 women here and now who had his brain tied in knots. They were what was important. Nynaeve and the others were avoiding him as if he had fleas. 5 times he had been to the palace, and the once they would see him, it was to say they were too busy for him, and send him away like an errand boy. It all added up to one thing. They thought he would interfere with whatever they were up to, and the only reason he would do that was if they were putting themselves in danger. They were not complete fools. Idiots often, but not complete fools. If they saw danger, there was danger. Some places in this city, being a stranger or showing a coin could bring a knife in your ribs, and not even channeling would stop it if they did not see it in time. And here he was, with Nalisian and a dozen good men from the band, not to mention Tom and Julian, who actually had rooms in the servants' quarters of the palace, all left to twiddle their thumbs. Those thick-skulled women trying to get their throats cut yet? Not if I can help it, he growled. What? Nalisian said. Look, they're lining up, Matt. Well, I burn my soul, I hope you're right. That piebald doesn't look half crazed to me. He looks eager. The horses were prancing, taking their places between tall poles stuck in the ground, with streamers tailing from the tops of them in a warm breeze. Blue and green and every color, some striped. 500 paces down the track of hard-beaten red clay, an identical number of streamered poles made another row. Each rider had to round the same colored streamer as floated to his right at the start, and then return. A booker stood at either end of the line of horses, just to the front. A round woman and a rounder man, each with a white scarf held overhead. The bookers took turns at this, and were not allowed to accept wagers on a race they started. Burn me, Elysian muttered. Light, man, be easy. You'll tickle your seamstress under the chin yet. A roar drowned the last word as the scarves came down and the horses surged forward, even the sound of their hooves submerged in the noise of the crowd. In 10 strides, Wind had the lead, Oliver lying close on his neck, with the silver-maned Dun only a head back. The piebald trailed in the pack, where the riders' switches already rose and fell frantically. I told you the Dun was dangerous, Elysian moaned. We shouldn't have wagered everything. Matt did not bother to answer. He had another purse in his pocket, and loose coins besides. He called the purse his seed. With that, with even a few of the coins in it, and a game of dice, he could repair his fortunes whatever happened this morning. Halfway down the course, Wind still held the lead, the Dun clinging close a full length ahead of the next horse. The piebald was running fifth. After the turn would come the hazard. Boys on trailing animals were known to slash at those who rounded the stakes ahead of them. Following the horses, Matt's eyes swept across the sharp-faced woman again, and snapped back. The shouts and screams of the crowd faded. The woman was shaking her fan at the horses and jumping excitedly, but suddenly he saw her in pale green and a rich gray cloak. Her hair caught in a frothy net of lace, skirts held up delicately as she picked away across a stable not far from Camelin. Rand still lay there moaning in the straw, even if the fever seemed gone. At least he was not shouting any more at people who were not there. Matt eyed the woman suspiciously as she knelt beside Rand. Maybe she could help as she claimed, but Matt did not trust as he once had. What was a fine lady like this doing in a village stable? Caressing the ruby-tipped hilt of the dagger hidden by his coat, he wondered why he had ever trusted it. It never paid. Never. Weak as a day-old kitten, she was saying as she reached beneath her cloak. I think... A knife appeared in her hand so suddenly, streaking for Matt's throat, that he would have been dead if he had not been ready. Dropping flat, he seized her wrist, just pushing it away from him, the curved Shadar-Logoth blade sweeping out to lie against her slim white neck. The woman froze, trying to look down at the sharp edge dimpling her skin. He wanted to slice, especially when he saw where her own dagger had stabbed into the stable wall. Around the slim blade, a black circle of char grew, and a thin gray tendril of smoke rose from wood about to burst into flame. Shivering, Matt rubbed a hand across his eyes. Just carrying that Shadar-Logoth knife had nearly killed him, eating those holes in his memories. But how could he forget a woman who tried to kill him? A dark friend, she had admitted as much, who tried to kill him with a dagger that set a bucket of water near boiling when they tossed it in after securing her in the tack room. A dark friend who had been hunting Rand and him. What chance she was in Ebou Dar when he was, at the races on the same day? ta'Veren might be the answer. He liked thinking of that about as much as he did the horn of bloody Valir. But the fact was, the Forsaken knew his name. That stable had not been the last time dark friends tried putting an end to Matt Cawthon. He staggered as Elysian suddenly began pounding his back. Look at him, Matt! Light of heaven, look at him! The horses had rounded the far poles and were well on their way back. Head stretched out, mane and tail flying behind, Wind streaked down the course with Oliver clinging to his back like a part of the saddle. The boy rode as if he had been born there. 4 lengths behind, the piebald pounded furiously, Ryder working his switch in a futile effort to close. Just like that, they slashed across the finish line, with the next nearest horse another 3 lengths back. The white-maned Dun came last. The moans and mutters of losing betters overwhelmed the shouts of winners. Losing tokens made a shower of white onto the track, and dozens of the booker's servants rushed out to clear them away before the next race. We have to find that woman, Matt. I'd not put it past her to run off without paying out so much as she owes us. From what Matt had heard, the Bookers Guild was more than harsh the first time one of its members tried anything of the sort, and deadly the second. But they were commoners, and that was enough for an Elysian. She's standing right over there in plain view. Matt gestured without taking his eyes from the fox-faced dark friend. Glaring at a token, she hurled it to the ground and even lifted her skirts to stamp on it. plainly not a wager on wind. Still grimacing, she began threading her way through the crowd. Matt stiffened. She was leaving. Gather our winnings, Nalesian, then take Oliver back to the inn. If he misses his reading lesson, you'll kiss the Dark One's sister before Mistress Anan lets him out for another race. Where are you going? I saw a woman who tried to kill me, Matt said over his shoulder. Give her a trinket next time, Nalesian shouted after him. Following the woman was no trouble, what with that white-plumed hat for a banner bobbing through the crowd on the other side. The earthen banks gave way to a large open area, where brightly lacquered coaches and sedan chairs waited under the watchful eyes of drivers and bearers. Matt's horse Pips was one of scores being guarded by members of the ancient and worshipful Guild of Stablemen. There was a guild for most things in Abu Dar, and woe to anyone who trespassed on their ground. He paused, but she walked on by the conveyances that had brought those with position or money. No maid, and now not even a chair. No one walked in this heat who had money to ride. Had milady come on hard times? The Silver Circuit lay just south of the tall, white-plastered city wall, and she strolled up the 100 paces or so of road to the broad pointed arch of the Moldine Gate and in. Trying to appear casual, Matt followed. The gateway was 10 spans of dim tunnel, but her hat stood out among the folk passing through. People who had to walk seldom wore plumes. She seemed to know where she was going on the other side. The plumes wove through the crowds ahead of him, unhurried but always moving forward. Abu Dar shone white in the morning sun. White palaces with white columns and screened wrought iron balconies cheek by jowl, with white plastered weavers' shops and fishmongers and stables. Great white houses with louvered shutters hiding their arched windows, beside white inns with painted signs hanging in front, and open markets under long roofs where live sheep and chickens, calves and geese and ducks made a barnyard din alongside their fellows already butchered and hanging. All white, stone or plaster, except here and there bands of red or blue or gold, on turnip-shaped domes and pointed spires that had balconies running around them. There were squares everywhere, always with a statue larger than life on a pedestal or a splashing fountain that only emphasized the heat. Always packed with people. Refugees filled the city, and merchants and traders of every sort. Never a trouble but brought profit to somebody. What Saldeia had once sent into Ara Daman now came downriver to Abu Dar. And so did what Ahmadiyya had traded into Tarban. Everyone scurried, for a coin or 1,000, for a bite to eat today. The aroma that hung in the air was equal parts perfume, dust, and sweat. Somehow, it all smelled desperate. Barge-filled canals sliced through the city, crossed by dozens of bridges, some so narrow that 2 people would have to squeeze past one another, others large enough that shops actually lined them, hanging out over the water. On one of those, he suddenly realized that the white-plumed hat had stopped. People flowed around him as he did too. The shops here were really just open wooden nooks, with heavy plank shutters that could be let down to close them off at night. Raised overhead now, the shutters displayed signs for the shops. The one above the plumed hat showed a golden scale and hammer, sign of the goldsmith's guild, though plainly not of a particularly prosperous member. Through a momentary gap in the crowd, he saw her look back and turned hurriedly to the narrow stall to his right. On the wall at the back hung finger rings and boards displaying stones cut in all sorts of designs. "My lord wishes a new signet ring?" the bird-like fellow behind the counter asked, bowing and dry-washing his hands. Skinny as a rail, he had no worry of anyone stealing his goods. Cramped into a corner on a stool sat a one-eyed fellow who might have had trouble standing upright inside the cubicle, with a long cudgel studded with nail heads propped between his massive knees. "I can cut any design, as my lord can see, and I have tryings for size, of course." "Let me see that one." Matt pointed at random. He needed some reason to stand here until she went on. It might be a good time to decide exactly what he was going to do. "A fine example of the long style, my lord, much in favor now. Gold, but I work in silver as well. Why, I think the size is right. If my lord will care to try it on, my lord may wish to examine the fine detail of the carving. Does my lord prefer gold or silver? With a grunt that he hoped might be taken for answer to some of that, Matt shoved the proffered ring onto the second finger of his left hand and pretended to examine the dark oval of carved stone. All he really saw was that it was as long as the joint of his finger. Head down, he studied the woman from the corner of his eye, the best he could through gaps that opened in the throng. She was holding a wide, flat gold necklace up to the light. There was a civil guard in Abu Dar, but not a very efficient one, seldom to be seen on the streets. If he denounced her, it would be his word against hers, and even if he was believed, a few coins might let her walk free even on that charge. The civil guard was cheaper than a magistrate, but either could be bought unless someone powerful was watching, and then if enough gold lay in the offer. A swirl in the crowd suddenly turned into a white cloak, conical helmet and long mail shirt gleaming like silver, snowy cloak with the flaring golden sun billowing as he strode along, confident that a path would clear for him. Which it certainly did. Few willingly put themselves in the way of the children of the light. Yet for every eye that slid away from the stone-faced man, another beamed on him approvingly. The sharp-faced woman not only looked at him openly, she smiled. A charge laid against her might or might not put her in prison, but it could be the spark to ignite a city full of tales about dark friends in the Tarasan Palace. White cloaks were good at whipping up mobs, and to them, Aes Sedai were dark friends. As the child of the light passed her, she laid down the necklace, apparently regretful, and turned to go. Does the style suit my lord? Matt gave a start. He had forgotten the skinny man, and the ring, too. No, I don't want... Frowning, he tugged at the ring again. It would not budge. No need to pull. You might crack the stone. Now that he was no longer a potential customer, Matt was no longer my lord either. Sniffing, the fellow kept a sharp eye on him, lest he try to run. I have some grease. Darrow, where's that grease pot? The guard blinked and scratched his head as if wondering what a grease pot was. The white-plumed hat was halfway to the end of the bridge already. I'll take it, Matt snapped. No time for haggling. Pulling up a fistful of coins from his coat pocket, he slapped them down on the counter, mostly gold and a little silver. Enough? The ringmaker's eyes bulged. A little too much, he quavered uncertainly. His hands hesitated above the coins. Then 2 fingers pushed a pair of silver pennies toward Matt. So much? Give them to Darrell, Matt growled as the bloody ring slipped from his finger. The skinny man was hurriedly raking up the rest of the coins. Too late to try backing out of the purchase. Matt wondered by just how much he had overpaid. Stuffing the ring into his pocket, he hastened after the dark friend. The hat was nowhere to be seen. Twinned statues decorated the end of the bridge, pale marble women over a tall span, each with one breast bared and a hand raised to point toward something in the sky. In Abu Dar, a bare chest symbolized openness and honesty. Ignoring stares, he climbed up beside one of the women, steadying himself with an arm around her waist. A street ran along the canal, and 2 more split off at angles ahead, all full of people in carts, sedan chairs, and wagons and coaches. Someone shouted in a rough voice about real women being warmer, and a number in the crowd laughed. White plumes appeared from behind a blue-lacquered coach on the left-hand fork. Leaping down, he pushed up the street after her, ignoring the curses of those he bumped. It was an odd chase. In the mass of people, with wagons and coaches constantly getting in his way, he could not keep a clear sight of the hat from the street. Scampering up the broad marble steps of a palace, he got another glimpse, then scurried back down to shove ahead. The rim of a tall fountain gave him yet another view, then an upended barrel against a wall, and a crate that had just been unloaded from an ox cart. Once he clung to the side of a wagon until the driver threatened him with her whip. With all the climbing and looking, he did not narrow the dark friend's lead very much. But then, he still had no notion what to do if he caught her. Suddenly, when he hoisted himself up onto the narrow coping along the face of one of the big houses, she was not there anymore. Frantically, he looked up and down the street. The white plumes no longer waved through the crowd. In easy sight were half a dozen houses, much like the one he was clinging to, several palaces of various sizes, 2 inns, 3 taverns, a cutler's shop with a knife and a pair of scissors on its sign, a fishmonger with a board painted in 50 kinds of fish, 2 rug weavers with unrolled carpets spread on tables beneath awnings, a tailor's shop, and 4 cloth sellers, 2 shops displaying lacquerware, a goldsmith, a silversmith, a livery stable. The list was too long. She could have gone into any of them, or none. She might have taken a turn he had not seen. Jumping down, he settled his hat, muttering under his breath, and saw her, almost at the top of the wide stairs leading to a palace nearly across from him, already half hidden by the tall fluted columns out front. The palace was not large, with only 2 slim spires and a single pear-shaped dome banded in red, but Ebudari palaces always gave the ground floor to servants and kitchens and the like. The better rooms were high, to catch the breezes. Doormen, liveried in black and yellow, bowed deeply and swung the carved doors wide before she reached them. A servant inside curtsied, apparently saying something, and immediately turned to lead her deeper. She was known. He would have wagered everything on it. For a while after the doors closed, he stood there studying the palace. Not the richest in the city by far, but only a noble would dare build its like. But who in the pit of doom lives there? He muttered finally, plucking off his hat to fan himself. Not her, not when she had to walk. A few questions in the taverns along the street would tell him, and word of his queries would seep to the palace, sure as dirt soiled your hands. Someone said, "Karadin." It was a scrawny, white-haired fellow lounging nearby in the shade. Matt looked at him questioningly, and he grinned, showing gaps in his teeth. His stooped shoulders and sad, weathered face did not fit his fine gray coat. Despite a bit of lace at his neck, he was the very picture of hard times. "You asked who lived there? The Chelsane Palace is let to Jakim Karadin." Matt's hat paused. "You mean the White Cloak ambassador?" "Aye, and Inquisitor of the Hand of the Light." The old man tapped a gnarled finger against the side of his beak of a nose. Both looked to have been broken several times. "Not a man to bother unless you must, and then I'd think 3 times." Unconsciously, Matt hummed a bit of Storm from the Mountains. Not a man to bother indeed. Questioners were the nastiest of the White Cloaks. A White Cloak Inquisitor who had a dark friend come to call. "Thank you." Matt gave a start. The fellow was gone, swallowed up in the crowd. Strange, but he had looked familiar. Maybe another long-dead acquaintance drifting out of those old memories. Maybe it hit him like an illuminator's night flower exploding inside his head. A white-haired man with a hooked nose. That old man had been at the Silver Circuit, standing not far from the woman who had just gone into Karadin's rented palace. Turning his hat in his hand, he frowned uneasily at the palace. The mire never held a bog like this one. He could feel the dice tumbling in his head suddenly, and that was always a bad sign. Chapter 15. Insects. Karadin did not look up immediately from the letter he was writing when the Lady Cheyenne, as she called herself, was shown in. 3 ants struggled futilely in the wet ink, trapped. Everything else might be dying, but ants and cockroaches and every sort of vermin seemed to thrive. Carefully, he pressed the blotter down. He was not about to begin again for a few ants. A failure to send this report, or a report of failure, might doom him as surely as those mired insects. Yet it was fear of a different failure that tightened his gut. He had no worry of Cheyenne reading what he wrote. It was in a cipher known only to 2 men beside himself. So many bands of dragons sworn at work, stiffened by a core of his most trusted men. So many more who might be bandits, or even truly sworn to that filth, Althor. Pedron Nile might not like that last, but his command had been to plunge Altara and Murundi into blood and chaos from which only Nile and the Children of the Light could rescue them. A madness clearly to be laid at the feet of this so-called dragon reborn, and that he had done. Fear held both countries by the throat. Tales that the witches marched across the same country were an added reward. Tarvalin witches and dragonsworn, Aes Sedai carrying off young women and setting up false dragons, villages in flames, and men nailed to the doors of their barns. It was all one in half the street rumors now. Nile would be pleased, and sent more orders. How he expected Cardin to snatch Elaine Trakand out of the Taliesin palace was beyond reason. Another ant skittered across the ivory inlaid table onto the page, and his thumb stabbed down, destroying it, and smearing a word to illegibility. The entire report would need to be redone. He wanted to drink very badly. There was brandy in a crystal flask on the table by the door, but he did not want the woman to see him drinking. Suppressing a sigh, he shoved the letter aside and pulled a kerchief from his sleeve to wipe his hand. So, Shaheen, do you finally have progress to report? Or have you just come for more money? She smiled at him lazily from a tall carved armchair. There are expenses associated with the search, she said in almost the accents of an Andron noble. Especially when we want no questions asked. Most people would have been unsettled by the sight of Jacob Carradine, even cleaning a pen nib, with his steely face and deep-set eyes, the white tabard over his coat bearing the golden sunburst of the Children of the Light impressed upon the crimson shepherd's crook of the hand. Not Millie Skane. That was her real name, though she did not know he knew. A saddler's daughter from a village near Whitebridge, she had gone to the White Tower at 15. Another thing she thought secret. It was hardly the best start, becoming a friend of the dark because the witches told her she could not learn to channel. But before that year was out, she had not only found a circle in Camelin, but made her first kill. In the 7 years since, she had added 19 more. She was one of the best assassins available, and a hunter who could find anyone or anything. That much he had been told when she was sent to him. A circle reported to her now. Several of them actually were nobles, and almost all were older. But neither thing mattered among those who served the Great Lord. Another circle working for Carradine was led by a gnarled beggar with one eye, no teeth, and the habit of bathing only once in the year. Had circumstances been different, Carradine himself would have knelt to Old Cully, the only name the stinking villain admitted to. Millie Skane surely grovelled for Old Cully, and so did every last companion of her circle, noble or not. It irritated Carradine that Lady Cheyenne would be on her knees in a flash if the straggly-haired old beggar entered the room, but for him she sat with her legs crossed, smiling, and twitching her slippered foot, as if impatient to be done. She had been ordered to obey him absolutely by one even Old Cully would grovel for. Besides, he had a desperate need of success. Niall's schemes could go to dust, but not this. Many things can be excused, he said, laying the pen on its ivory stand and shoving back his chair, for those who accomplish the tasks they are given. He was a tall man, and he loomed threateningly. He was well aware that the gilt-framed mirrors on the wall showed a figure of strength, a dangerous man. Even dresses and baubles and gambling, paid for with coin that was to go for information. That twitching foot froze for an instant, then began again, but her smile was forced, her face pale. Her circle obeyed her instantly, but they would string her up by the heels and skin her alive if he spoke the word. You have not accomplished very much, have you? In fact, you do not seem to have accomplished anything. And there are difficulties, as you well know, she said breathily. She managed to meet his eyes squarely, though. Excuses. Tell me of difficulties surmounted, not those you stumble over and fall. You can fall a long way if you fail in this. Turning his back, he strode to the nearest window. He could fall a long way, too, and he did not want to risk her seeing anything in his eyes. Sunlight slanted through the ornate stone screen. The high-ceilinged room, with its green and white tiled floor and bright blue walls, stayed comparatively cool behind the thick walls of the palace, but the heat outside seeped in near the windows. He could almost feel the brandy across the room. He could not wait for her to be gone. My Lord Corridon, how can I have anyone ask too openly about objects of power? That will cause questions. And there are Aes Sedai in the city, you will recall. Peering down at the street through the scroll carvings, he wrinkled his nose at the smell. Every sword was jammed together down there. An Ara felon with his hair in 2 long braids and a curved sword on his back tossed a coin to a one-armed beggar who scowled at the gift before tucking it under his rags and resuming his piteous cries to the passers-by. A fellow in a torn, bright red coat and even brighter yellow breeches came running from his shop clutching a bolt of cloth to his chest, pursued by a shouting, pale-haired woman who had her skirts pulled above her knees and was outpacing the burly guard who lumbered behind her, waving his truncheon. The driver of a red-lacquered coach with the moneylender's gold coins and open hand on the door shook his whip at the driver of a canvas-covered wagon whose team had become entangled with the coaches, the pair filling the street with curses. Grimy street urchins crouched behind a dilapidated cart while they snatched puny, shriveled fruit brought in from the country. A Tarabunner woman pushed her way through the crowd, veiled, her dark hair in thin braids, drawing every male eye in her dusty red dress that shaped itself to her form shamelessly. My lord, I must have time. I must. I cannot do the impossible. Certainly not in days. Trash, all of them. Grubbers for gold and hunters for the horn. Thieves, refugees, even tinkers. Scum. Riots would be easy to start. A purge for all this filth. Outlanders were always the first targets, always to blame for whatever was wrong, along with neighbors who had the misfortune to be on the wrong side of grudges, women who peddled herbs and cures, and folk with no friends, especially if they lived alone. Properly guided, as carefully as such things could be, a good riot might well burn the Tarasim Palace down around that useless Jade Tylan and the witches as well. He glared at the swarm below. Riots did tend to get out of hand. The civil guard might stir itself, and inevitably a handful of true friends would be snapped up. He could not afford the chance that some of those might be from the circles he had hunting. For that matter, even a few days of rioting would disrupt their work. Tylan was not important enough for that. She did not matter at all, in truth. No, not yet. Niall he could afford to disappoint, but not his daughter. My Lord Corridon, a note of defiance had entered Cheyenne's voice. He had let her stew too long. My Lord Corridon, some of my circle question why we are looking for... He started to turn, to put her down hard. He needed success, not excuses, not questions. But her voice dwindled to nothing as his eyes fell on a young man standing diagonally across the street, in a blue coat with enough red and gold embroidery on the sleeves and lapels for 2 nobles. Taller than most, he was fanning himself with a broad-brimmed black hat and adjusting his neck scarf as he spoke to a stooped, white-haired man. Corridon recognized the young man. Suddenly he felt as though a knotted rope had been fastened around his head and was being drawn ever tighter. For an instant, a face hidden behind a red mask filled his vision. Night-dark eyes stared at him, and then were endless caverns of flame, and still staring. Within his head, the world exploded in fire, cascading images that battered him and swept him beyond, screaming. The forms of 3 young men stood unsupported in air, and one of them began to glow. The form of the man in the street. Brighter and brighter, till it must have seared any living eyes to ash. Brighter still, burning. A curled golden horn sped toward him, its cry pulling his soul, then flashed into a ring of golden light, swallowing him, chilling him until the last fragment of him that recalled his name was sure his bones must splinter. A ruby-tipped dagger hurtled straight at him, curved blade striking him between the eyes and sinking in, until gold-wrapped hilt and all was gone. And he knew agony that washed away all thought that what had gone before was pain. He would have prayed to a creator he had long abandoned if he remembered how. He would have shrieked if he remembered how, if he remembered that humans shrieked, that he was human. On and on, more and more. Raising a hand to his forehead, he wondered why it trembled. His head ached, too. There had been something. He gave a start at the street below. Everything was changed in the blink of an eye, the people different, wagons moved, colorful coaches and chairs replaced by others. Worse, Cawthon was gone. He wanted to swallow that whole flask of brandy in one gulp. Suddenly he realized that Cheyenne had stopped talking. He turned, ready to continue putting her in her place. She was leaning forward in the act of rising, one hand on the arm of her chair, the other raised in a gesture. Her narrow face was fixed in petulant defiance, but not at Carradine. She did not move. She did not blink. He was not sure she breathed. He barely noticed her. "Ruminating," Samael said. "Can I at least hope that it was about what you are here to find for me?" He stood only a little taller than average, a muscular, solid man in a coat of the high-collared Illianer style. So covered with gold work it was hard to tell the cloth was green. But more than being one of the chosen gave him stature. His blue eyes were colder than a winter's heart. A livid scar burned down his face from golden hairline to the edge of golden, square-cut beard, and it seemed a suitable decoration. Whatever got in his way was brushed aside, trampled, or obliterated. Carradine knew Samael would have turned his bowels to water if the man had just been someone met by chance. Hurriedly moving from the window, he dropped to his knees before the chosen. He despised the Tarvalin witches. Indeed, he despised anyone who used the One Power, meddling with what had broken the world once, wielding what mere mortals should not touch. This man used the power, too. But the chosen could not be called mere mortals. Perhaps not mortals at all. And if he served well, neither would he be. "Great Master, I saw Matt Cawthon." "Here?" Oddly for a moment, Samael seemed taken aback. He murmured something under his breath, and the blood drained from Carradine's face at one caught word. "Great Lord, you know I would never betray." "You fool. I'm in the stomach. Are you certain it was Cawthon you saw?" "Yes, Great Master. In the street. I know I can find him again." Samael frowned down at him, stroking his beard, looking through and beyond Jacob Carradine. Carradine did not like feeling insignificant, especially when he knew it was true. "No," Samael said finally. "Your search is the most important thing, the only thing, so far as you are concerned. Cawthon's death would be convenient, certainly, but not if it draws attention here. If it appears that attention is already here, should he take an interest in your search, then he dies, but otherwise he can wait." "But did you mishear me?" Samael's scar pulled his smile into a snarl on one side. "I saw your sister Venora recently. She did not look well at first. Screaming, weeping, twitching constantly and pulling at her hair. Women do suffer worse than men from the attentions of Myrddraal. But even Myrddraal must find their pleasures somewhere. Don't worry that she suffered too long. The Trollocs are always hungry." The smile faded. His voice was stone. Those who disobey can find themselves over a cook fire too. Venora seemed to be smiling, Karadin. Do you think you would smile, turning on a spit? Karadin swallowed in spite of himself and quelled a pang for Venora. With her ready laugh and her skill with horses, daring to gallop where others feared to walk. She had been his favorite sister, yet she was dead and he was not. If there were any mercies in the world, she had not learned why. I live to serve and obey, Great Master. He did not believe he was a coward, but no one disobeyed one of the chosen. Not more than once. Then find what I want, Samael roared. I know it's hidden somewhere in this Kajasic flyspeck of a city. Terangreal, Langreal, even Sangreal. I have tracked them, traced them. Now you find them, Karadin. Do not make me grow impatient. Great Master. He worked his mouth to find moisture. Great Master. There are witches. Aes Sedai here. I cannot be sure how many. If they hear a whisper. Waving him to silence, Samael paced a few quick steps, 3 times up and back, hands clasped behind his back. He did not look worried, only considering. Finally, he nodded. I will send you someone to deal with these Aes Sedai. He barked a short laugh. I almost wish I could see their faces. Very well. You have a little while longer. Then perhaps someone else will have a chance. He lifted a strand of Shien's hair with a finger. She still did not move. Her eyes stared, unblinking. This child would certainly leap at the opportunity. Karadin fought down a stab of fear. The chosen cast down as quickly as they raised up, and as often. Failure never went unpunished. Great Master, the favor I asked of you. If I might know, will you? There is very little luck in you, Karadin, Samael said with another smile. You had better hope you have more carrying out my orders. It seems that someone is making sure at least some of Ishamael's commands are still carried out. He was smiling, but he seemed far from amused. Or perhaps it was just the scar. You failed him, and you've lost your entire family for it. Only my hand protects you now. Once, long ago, I saw 3 Myrddraal make a man give them his wife and his daughters one by one, then beg them to cut off his right leg, then the left, then his arms, and burn out his eyes. The perfectly ordinary conversational tone made the recitation worse than any shouts or snarls ever could have. It was a game with them, you understand, to see how much they could make him beg them to take. They left his tongue for last, of course, but there wasn't a great deal of him remaining by then. He had been quite powerful, handsome, and famous. Envied. No one would ever envy what they finally tossed to the Trollocs. You wouldn't believe the sounds it made. Find what I want, Karadin. You will not like it if I withdraw my hand. Abruptly, there was a vertical line of light in the air before the chosen. It seemed to turn in some fashion, widening as it did into a square hole. Karadin gaped. He was staring through a hole in the sky, where full of gray columns and thick mist. Samael stepped through, and the opening snapped shut, a brilliant bar of light that vanished, leaving only a purple afterimage glowing in Karadin's eyes. Unsteadily, he pushed himself to his feet. Failure was always punished, but no one survived disobeying one of the chosen. Suddenly, Cheyenne moved, completing her halted rise from the chair. You mark me, Bors, she began, then cut off, staring at the window where he had been standing. Her eyes darted, found him, and she jumped. He could have been one of the Chosen himself from the way those eyes bulged. No one survived disobeying the Chosen. He pressed his hands against his temples. His head felt tight to bursting. There is a man in the city. Matt Cawthon. You will... She gave a small start, and he frowned. You know him? I have heard the name, she said warily, and angrily, he would have said. Few linked to Althor remain unknown for long. As he stepped closer, she crossed her arms protectively in front of herself and held her place with an obvious effort. What is a seedy farm boy doing in Ebudar? How did he... Don't bother me with foolish questions, Cheyenne. His head had never hurt like this. Never. It felt as though a dagger was being driven into his skull between his eyes. No one survived. You will put your circle to locating Cawthon immediately. All of them. Old Cully was coming tonight, slipping in through the back of the stables. She did not need to know there would be others. Nothing else is to get in the way. But I thought... She broke off with a gasp as he seized her neck. A slim dagger appeared, but he wrenched it away. She twisted and jerked, but he drove her face down onto the table, her cheek smudging still damp ink on the discarded letter to Pedro Nile. The dagger, stabbing down just in front of her eyes, froze her. By chance, the blade piercing the paper had caught his hand by the tip of one leg. It struggled as vainly as she had. You are insane, eh? The pain in his head, his voice rasped. It is time
Do
for
that for a call tonight.
One insect is much like another, and if one won't do. Her eyes followed his thumb down. When it flattened on the end, she flinched. I live to serve and obey, Master, she breathed. She had said that to old Cully every time they saw them together, but never before him. And this is how we will obey. No one survived disobedience. No one. Chapter 16. A Touch on the Cheek. The Tarasin Palace was a mass of shining marble and white plaster with screened balconies of white-painted wrought iron and columned walks, as much as 4 stories above the ground. Pigeons wheeled around pointed domes and tall balcony-wreathed spires banded in red and green tiles, glittering in the sun. Sharp-arched gates in the palace itself led to various courtyards. More pierced the high wall hiding the gardens. But deep, snowy white steps, 10 spans wide, climbed on the side facing Malhara Square, to great doors carved in coiling patterns like velvet skins, and covered with beaten gold. The dozen before those doors wore gilded breastplates over green coats, stuffed into dark green boots. Green cords secured thick twists of white cloth around glittering golden helmets, with the long ends hanging down their backs. Even their halberds and the scabbards of their daggers and short swords shone with gold. Guards for being looked at, not fighting. But then, when Matt reached the top, he could see swordsmen's calluses on their hands. Always before he had entered through one of the stable yards to peruse the palace horses in passing. But this time he was going in the way a lord would. The light's blessing on all here, he said to their officer, a man not much older than he. Ebudari were polite people. I've come to leave a message for Nynaeve Sedai and Elaine Sedai, or to give it to them if they've returned. The officer stared at him, looked at the stairs in consternation. Gold cord as well as green on his pointed helmet signified some rank Matt did not know, and he carried a gilded rod instead of a halberd, with a sharp end and a hook like an ox goad. By his expression, no one had ever come up that way before. Studying Matt's coat, he mulled it over visibly, and at last decided he could not tell him to go away. With a sigh, the man murmured a benison in return and asked Matt's name, pushed open a small door in one of the larger, and ushered him into a grand entry hall, encircled by 5 stone-railed balconies beneath a domed ceiling painted like the sky, complete with clouds and a sun. The guard's snapping fingers summoned a slim young serving woman in a white dress, sewn up on the left and embroidered on the left breast, with a green anchor and sword. She scurried across the red and blue marble floor, looking startled, curtsying to Matt and the officer each. Short black hair framed a sweetly pretty face, with silken olive skin, and her livery had the deep, narrow neckline common to all women except nobles in Ebudar. For once, Matt did not really notice. When she heard what he wanted, her big black eyes widened even more. Aes Sedai were not unpopular in Ebudar, exactly, but most Ebudari would go a long distance out of their way to avoid one. Yes, Sword Lieutenant, she said, bobbing again. Of course, Sword Lieutenant. May it please you to follow me, my lord? It did. Outside, Ebudar sparkled white, but inside, the color ran wild. There seemed to be miles of broad corridor in the palace, and here the ceiling was blue and the walls yellow, there the walls pale red and the ceiling green, changing with every turn. Combinations to jar any eye but a tinker's. Matt's boots sounded loud on the floor tiles that made patterns of 2 or 3 or sometimes 4 colors in diamonds or stars or triangles. Wherever hallways crossed, the floor was a mosaic of tiny tiles, intricate swirls and scrolls and loops. A few silk tapestries displayed scenes of the sea, and arched niches held carved crystal bowls and small statues and yellow sea-folk porcelain that would fetch a fine penny anywhere. Occasionally, a liveried servant hurried along silently, often as not carrying a silver tray or a golden. Normally, displays of wealth made Matt feel comfortable. For one thing, where there was money, some might stick to his fingers. This time he felt impatient, more so by the step, and anxious. The last time he had felt the dice rolling so hard in his head was just before he found himself with 300 of the band, 1,000 of Gabriel's white lions on a ridge to his front, and another 1,000 coming hard up the road behind him. And all he had been trying to do was ride away from the entire mess. That time he had avoided the chop by the grace of other men's memories and more luck than he had a right to. The dice almost always meant danger, and something else he had not figured out yet. The prospect of having his skull cracked was not enough, and once or twice there had been no possibility of such, yet the upcoming likelihood of Matt Cawthon dead in some spectacular fashion seemed the most usual cause. Unlikely, maybe, in the Tarasan Palace, but unlikely did not make the dice go away. He was going to leave his message, grab Nynaeve and Elaine by the scruff of the neck if he had an opportunity, give them a talking to that made their ears glow, and then get out. The young woman glided ahead of him until they reached a short, bullish man, a little older than she, another servant, in tight white breeches, a white shirt with wide sleeves, and a long green vest with the anchor and sword of House Mitsobar in a white disc. Master Jen, she said, curtsying once more, this is Lord Matt Cawthon, who wishes to leave a message for the honored Elaine Aes Sedai and the honored Nynaeve Aes Sedai. Very good, Hazel. You may go. He bowed to Matt. May it please you to follow me, my lord? Jen led him as far as a dark, grim-faced woman, short of her middle years, and bowed. Mistress Karen, this is Lord Matt Cawthon, who wishes to leave a message for the honored Elaine Aes Sedai and the honored Nynaeve Aes Sedai. Very good, Jen. You may go. May it please you to follow me, my lord? Karen took him up a sweeping flight of marble stairs, the risers painted yellow and red, to a skinny woman named Matilda, who handed him over to a stout fellow named Bren, who led him to a balding man named Maddock, each a little older than the one before. Where 5 corridors met like the spokes of a wheel, Maddock left him with a round woman called Laren, who had a touch of gray at her temples and a stately carriage. Like Karen and Matilda, she wore what the Ebudari called a marriage knife, hanging hilt down from a close-fitting silver necklace between more than plump breasts. 5 white stones in the hilt, 2 set in red, and 4 red stones, one surrounded by black, said 3 of her 9 children were dead, 2 sons in duels. Rising out of her curtsy to Matt, Laren began to float up one of the hallways, but he hurried to catch her arm. Dark eyebrows rose slightly as she glanced at his hand. She had no dagger except the marriage knife, but he released her immediately. Custom said she could only use that on her husband. Yet there was no point in pushing. He did not soften his voice, though. How far do I have to go to leave a note? Show me to their rooms. A pair of Aes Sedai shouldn't be that hard to find. This isn't the bloody White Tower. Aes Sedai, a woman said behind him in a heavy Illianer accent. If you do seek to Aes Sedai, you have found two. Laren's face did not change, or almost not. Her nearly black eyes darted past him, and he was sure they tightened with worry. Doffing his hat, Matt turned, wearing an easy smile. With that silver fox head around his neck, Aes Sedai did not put him off at all. Well, not very much. It had those flaws. Maybe the smile was not that easy. The two women confronting him could not have been more different. One was slender, with a fetching smile, in a gold and green dress that showed a hint of what he judged to be a fine bosom. Except for that ageless face, he might have thought to strike up a conversation. It was a pretty face, with eyes large enough for a man to sink into. A pity. The other one had the ageless face too, but seeing it took him a moment. He thought she was scowling until he realized that must be her normal expression. Her dark, almost black dress covered her to the wrists and chin, for which he was grateful. She looked scrawny as an old bramble. She looked as if she ate brambles for breakfast. I'm trying to leave a message for Nynaeve and Elaine, he told them. This woman... He blinked, looking down each of the corridors. Servants hurried by, but Laren was nowhere in sight. He would not have thought she could move so fast. Anyway, I want to leave a note. Suddenly cautious, he added, Are you friends of theirs? Not exactly, the pretty one said. I am Jolene, and this is Teslan. And you are Matt Cawthon. Matt's stomach tightened. 9 Aes Sedai in the palace, and he had to walk into the two who followed Elaida, and one of them red. Not that he had anything to fear. He lowered his hand to his side before he could touch the fox head under his clothes. The one who ate brambles, Teslan, stepped closer. She was a sitter, according to Tom, though what a sitter was doing here, even Tom did not understand. We would be their friends if we could. They do need friends, Master Cawthon, as do you. Her eyes tried to dig holes in his head. Jolene moved to flank him, laying a hand on his lapel. He would have considered that smile inviting from another woman. She was Green Aja. They are on dangerous ground and blind to what lies beneath their feet. I know you are their friend. You might show it by telling them to abandon this nonsense before it is too late. Foolish children who go too far can find themselves punished quite severely. Matt wanted to back away. Even Teslan stood close enough to be almost touching him. Instead, he put on his most insolent grin. It had always landed him in trouble back home, but it seemed appropriate. Those dice in his head could have nothing to do with this pair, or they would have stopped spinning. And he did have the medallion. They see pretty well, I'd say. Nynaeve badly needed to be snatched down a peg or 6, and Elaine even more, but he was not about to stand by and listen to this woman talk Nynaeve down. If that meant defending Elaine too, so be it. Maybe you should abandon your nonsense. Jolene's smile vanished, but Teslan replaced it with one of her own, a razored smile. We do know about you, Master Cawthon. She looked a woman who wanted to skin something, and whoever was handy would do. ta'veren, it do be said, with dangerous associations of your own. That do be more than hearsay. Jolene's face was ice. A young man in no position who wished to be assured of his future could do much worse than seek the protection of the tower. You should never have left it. His stomach clenched tighter. What else did they know? Surely not about the medallion. Nynaeve and Elaine knew, and Adelias and Bandine, the light only knew who they had told. Surely not this pair. There was worse than ta'veren or the Foxhead, though, or even ran, as far as he was concerned. They knew about the bloody horn. Abruptly, he was yanked away from them so hard that he stumbled and nearly dropped his hat. A slender woman with a smooth face and nearly white hair gathered at the back of her neck had him by sleeve and lapel. Reflexively, Teslin seized him the same way on the other side. He recognized the straight-backed newcomer in her plain gray dress, in a way. She was either Adelius or Vendine, two sisters, real sisters, not just Aes Sedai, who might as well have been twins. He could never tell them apart for certain. She and Teslin stared at one another, chill and serene, two cats with a paw on the same mouse. No need to tear my coat off, he growled, trying to shrug free. My coat? He was not sure they heard. Even wearing the fox head, he was not prepared to go as far as prying their fingers free, unless he had to. Two other Aes Sedai accompanied whichever sister it was, though one, a dark, stocky woman with inquisitive eyes, was marked by no more than the great serpent ring and the brown-fringed shawl she wore, displaying the white flame of Tarvalin among vines on her back. She appeared to be just a little older than Nynaeve, which made her Saritha Talaris, only 2 years or so Aes Sedai. Do you stoop to kidnapping men in the halls now, Teslin? The other one said. A man who cannot channel can hardly be of interest to you. Short and pale in lace-trimmed gray, slashed with blue, she was all cool, ageless elegance and confident smile. Her Kyrianan accent identified her. He had certainly attracted the top dogs in the yard. Tom had not been sure whether Jolene or Teslin was in charge of Elida's embassy, but Merlilla led the one from those idiots who had tricked Egwene into becoming their envoy. That could have shaved with Teslin's return smile. Do not dissemble with me, Merlilla. Let Cawthon do be of considerable interest. He should all be running loose. As if he was not standing there listening. Don't fight over me, he said. Tucking his coat was not making anyone let go. There's enough to go around. 5 sets of eyes made him wish he had kept his mouth shut. Aes Sedai had no sense of humor. He pulled a little harder, and Vendine, or Adelius, jerked back hard enough to pull the coat out of his hand. Vendine, he decided. She was green, and he had always thought she wanted to turn him upside down and shake the secret of the medallion out of him. But whichever she was, she smiled, part knowing, part amused. He saw nothing funny. The others did not look at him long. He might as well have vanished. What he needs, Jolene said firmly, is to be taken into custody for his own protection and more. 3 ta'veren coming out of a single village, and one of them the Dragon Reborn. Master Cawthon should be sent to the White Tower immediately. And he had thought her brain. Merlilla only shook her head. You overestimate your situation here, Jolene, if you think I will simply allow you to take the boy. You overestimate yours, Merlilla. Jolene stepped closer until she was looking down at the other woman. Her lips curved, superior and condescending. Or do you understand that it's only a wish not to offend Tynan that keeps us from confining all of you on bread and water until you can be returned to the tower? Not expecting Merlilla to laugh in her face, but she shifted her head slightly as if she really wanted to break away from Jolene's gaze. You would not dare. Saritha wore Aes Sedai tranquility like a mask, face smooth and hands calmly adjusting her shawl, but her breathy voice shouted that it wasn't a mask. These are children's games, Jolene, Vendine murmured dryly. Surely that was who she was. She was the only one of the 3 who really did appear unruffled. Faint splashes of color blossomed on Merlilla's cheeks as if the white-haired woman had spoken to her, but her own gaze steadied. You can hardly expect us to go meekly, she told Jolene firmly, and there are 5 of us. 7, counting Nynaeve and alone. The last was a clear afterthought, and reluctant at that. Jolene arched an eyebrow. Teslin's bony fingers did not loosen their grip any more than Vendine's, but she studied Jolene and Merlilla with an unreadable expression. Aes Sedai were a country of strangers, where you never knew what to expect until it was too late. There were deep currents here. Deep currents around Aes Sedai could snatch a man to his death without them so much as noticing. Maybe it was time to start frying at fingers. Laren's sudden reappearance saved him the effort. Struggling to control her breath, as if she had been running, the plump woman spread her skirts in a curtsy markedly deeper than she had given. Forgiveness for disturbing you, Aes Sedai, but the Queen summons Lord Cawthon. Forgiveness, please. It's more than my ears are worth if I don't bring him straight away. The Aes Sedai looked at her, all of them, till she began to fidget. Then the two groups stared at one another as if trying to see who could out-Aes Sedai who. And then they looked at him. He wondered whether anybody was going to move. I can't keep the Queen waiting now, can I? He said cheerily. From the sniffs, you would have thought he had pinched somebody's bottom. Even Laren's brows drew down in disapproval. Release him, Annelius, R'lyeh said finally. He frowned as the white-haired woman complied. Those two ought to wear little signs with their names or different color hair ribbons or something. She gave him another of those amused, knowing smiles. He hated that. It was a woman's trick, not just Aes Sedai, and they usually did not know anything at all like what they wanted you to believe. Teslan, he said. The grim red still had hold of his coat with both hands. She peered up at him, ignoring everyone else. The Queen. R'lyeh opened her mouth and hesitated, obviously changing what she had been going to say. How long do you intend to stand here holding him, Teslan? Perhaps.
Alright, everyone. I'm going to call into this live for tonight. I want to thank Aaron for stopping by, and Aaron keeps stopping by. Definitely appreciate all y'all's support. Excuse me. Till next time, everyone. Y'all stay safe out there.